are you interested in gender and disaster?
Well, I've got a long-standing interest in gender that goes back many, many years from the second wave of the women's movement. So I've been involved in gender issues for quite a long time. I've only recently started to connect with the whole notion of disasters, and I think it began actually when you and Deborah invited me to be on a reference group for the Men and Bushfires project that really kind of to bring a masculinity lens to the kinds of experiences of men following the bushfires, and also to offer some explanation about why men's violence against women seemed to escalate following a disaster. So for me, the whole area of disasters is a new area. It's been really challenging, and it's been to sort of bring the kind of what I've been doing historically around gender and gendered violence to start to look at what light that might shed on men's experience of disasters, but perhaps more importantly, how we might actually begin to think about preventing disasters and using a gender lens to understand prevention, as well as just looking at men's experience of them leading up to them and the aftermath of them.
So, Bob, what role does privilege play in society, and who has it, and how is it perpetuated?
Okay. I see privilege as the other side of disadvantage and oppression. And so for every group that is disadvantaged and oppressed, there is a privileged group who benefit from that oppression. So if women are disadvantaged, men are advantaged. If Indigenous people are disadvantaged, people with white skin are advantaged. If those that gay and lesbian and transgender are discriminated against, then heterosexual people gain advantages and benefits through that process. So it operates through the processes often of members of privileged groups being unconscious of their privilege. So it doesn't require outward prejudice, although sometimes it can involve prejudice, as we know all too well, but more often than not, it involves members of privileged groups just going around living their lives without a consciousness and awareness of how they may be reproducing inequalities. So privilege is a form of unearned advantage. You gain it by virtue of membership, of being born into a group that's male, a group that's white. So it's not something you earned, it's something you worked for. It comes out of your membership of particular groups, it's unearned, and continuing to hang on to it without being aware of it is reproducing the inequalities in our society.
So how is privilege apparent in the management of disasters?
I think it's apparent in terms of the management. Emergency service organisations historically and continue to be male-dominated organisations. They operate on a command structure that's often military-like in its formation, very hierarchical. So the way in which disasters are managed then tends to reproduce and reflect the more patriarchal forms of organisation. And I think we need to sort of understand the unconscious elements that play out. We know that they're dominated by men, that women have started to make some inroads into those organisations, but not without some cost. So I think we need to start to look at the gender composition of emergency service organisations and how the way in which they operate and function may be reproducing some gendered inequalities in our society.
Can you give me some examples of those gender inequalities in emergency services?
Well, apart from the way in which women who join the ranks of those organisations are treated, often the way in which they have to survive is to be like one of the guys. That means they have to go along with the kind of the joking, sometimes the sexualising of situations. They have to be almost become one of the guys to be able to be accepted. I think it can also function in ways that, I mean, we know that there's a particular kind of masculinity associated with being a firefighter, and we have this iconic image of the firefighter who with no concern about his own safety rushes into a burning building and carries somebody out over their back. So there's a very heroic kind of masculinity involved in the kind of firefighting, the sharp end of emergency services. But there may be less interest by firefighters in prevention. There's not the same kind of masculinity that's involved in that kind of rescuing, fighting fires, is a kind of different kind of masculinity that may be required if we want to start thinking about how we might prevent fires in the first place, saving more lives through prevention than rescuing. So perhaps if we start to think about the way masculinity is connected to the functioning of these organisations, we may get more of a focus on prevention than we have in the past.
It sounds to me like you're saying there are rewards for being that, or trying to live up to that iconic firefighter.
There clearly are rewards, but there are costs as well, because in living up to those expectations, it means that men have to close down their own vulnerability, their own emotions. We know from the experiences of men who have been interviewed, but by yourself and Deborah, how the men were unable to talk about their experiences, because to do so would mean that they would lose their status and prestige in some way. They may not be approached and asked to be involved in the future. So there are costs for men as well as benefits and privileges, I think.
So, the privileges we'll just talk about in the management of disasters, what can we do about it in the short term and in the long term?
In the short term, I think the first step is for men to become conscious and aware of them having privilege, and then to become educated about the benefits that flow from having that privilege, and then to become aware about how those benefits which they gain through privilege involves them in some level of complicity with forms of gender inequality. So I think there's an educational role to play, to engage men, to think and reflect on their privilege, to become more aware of the benefits they get out of it, and start to face the very difficult and sometimes painful and discomforting task of beginning to explore their own complicity. That's in the short term. In the longer term, I think we have to really transform the structures of inequality. We really need to have high levels of equality at all throughout society, from the household to men doing their fair share of domestic work and childcare, through to equal representation of women in parliament and in government and on boards, and need to break down the gender division of labour. We need to look at the media and the way in which male values are promoted and exalted, and female values are marginalised. So we need to see a dramatic transformation of all sorts of structures of inequality in our society.
And in emergency management organisations?
And in emergency management organisations would start to mirror that as well. We'd see a greater representation of women. We'd see a greater awareness of men of the importance of gender issues. We'd see a greater level of cognizance by men of their privilege in society more broadly. We'd see men and women working more equally in partnership with each other. We'd see men listening to women as they talk about their experiences and their concerns.
So, finally, do you have an example when lack of attention to gender had negative consequences, or when an attention to gender had positive outcomes?
In many ways, at the broadest level, I think a lack of attention to gender is a contributing factor to many of the so-called natural disasters that we're experiencing. In many ways, even to refer to a disaster as natural implies that it's not man-made, and by man-made I'm gendering man here. So many of the disasters we've experienced are man-made, made by men, and so a lack of attention to gender means that we're not really addressing gendered understandings about the nature of climate change and the involvement of men in kind of escalating economic growth and technological development with no concern for environmental destruction. So the very fact that we don't have a heightened awareness about climate change in this country and the contribution climate change makes to so-called natural disasters, to me is an indication of where a gendered analysis hasn't been brought to bear.